Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back to part 2 of Eden in Egypt. If you haven't seen part 1, please do so. When we look at the Garden of Eden legend, we tend to focus too much on the Eden part, but not on the garden part. And I think the gardener Monty Don states it very well when he says,
I believe that a really good way to understand a culture is through its gardens. This is an extraordinary journey to visit 80 inspiring gardens from all over the world. Some are very well known, like the Taj Mahal or the Alhambra. And I'm also challenging my idea of what a garden actually is.
So as someone who studies landscape architecture, I want to challenge you on why I think Egypt's Nile Delta fits this idea of a garden. So now let's take a look at the logic on the documentary The Bible's Buried Secrets, The Real Garden of Eden, with Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou. Despite fair use due to YouTube's automated copyright flagging, I'll only be able to present to you the audio. To watch the full documentary, I'll leave a link below.
The king was the crucial link between the human and heavenly worlds, enjoying a special relationship with the gods. And this tells us exactly who Adam symbolized in the Eden story. Sacred gardens were built and maintained by kings. In the ancient Near East, there was no distinction between religion and politics, and the king embodied this. He functioned as a link between the divine realm and the earthly realm, mediating the relationship between his people and the gods. And his role in the sacred gardens reflected this. He was granted access by the gods to the garden in order to tend it and to cultivate it. In essence, he was the gardener of the gods. And this is exactly the role Adam plays in Eden. Not only does he enjoy privileged access to his God in the garden, but he's placed in Eden in order to tend and cultivate the garden. According to ancient Near Eastern belief systems, Adam fulfills the role of a king.
I totally agree. We are talking about an epic that has been passed down for thousands of years, with similarities to other mythologies, as Dr. Michael Heiser argues. The probability of this just being nomadic stories is low. It would have to have been a dynastic story for it to last this long. According to David Stronach of the University of California, Berkeley, who studies garden history, gardens in the past were always associated with rulers such as the Persians. Persian gardens have always symbolized a recreation of a lost paradise, and many Persian garden elements have derived from Mesopotamian and Egyptian roots. The Persians were really the last empire to inherit some of the elements of Egyptian culture. Garden culture is more valued in desert regions, and I think it was the Nile Delta which was the original inspiration of the idea of a paradise among a sea of death, where only the Aten or the Eden can reside in. What I disagree with Dr. Francesca's logic is that the Garden of Eden is just a temple. Temples are elements of a garden, the iconographies that make a garden's identity and symbolism. She wants to argue that the Garden of Eden is just a temple of Jerusalem, but her logic is too narrow-minded for an epic, and knowing that the original Israelites were Hyksos tribes of Egypt, as Ralph Ellison argues. To be able to categorize a garden, it's not enough just to have architecture. It needs plants, specifically edible plants, not just decorative details on building facades.
Ain Dara is a close parallel to the Jerusalem temple. Still, the question remains, how could a temple be a garden? The answer lies with the cherubim I encountered earlier. This imposing creature is a cherub. Genesis tells us cherubim guarded the entrance to the Garden of Eden, and they do the same here, keeping watch at the boundaries of the temple. And they were also in the Jerusalem temple. In the Book of Kings, we're told that cherubim are found on every wall in the temple. It portrays them as huge, monstrous creatures, standing 10 cubits high with a wingspan of another 10 cubits. Ain Dara shows us that the cherubs of the Jerusalem temple marked the boundaries to God's garden.
Well, if we're going with that logic, then I would argue the place that clearly had an entrance with cherubim guarding a garden would be at Giza. The fusion of a lion or a dog with a human symbolizes a god or an angelic being through a characteristics bestowed upon that particular god. I would argue the inspiration of this anthropomorphic depiction was inspired by the Sphinx. Egypt could have been the original inspiration for this art form. If Dr. Robert Schoch is right, the Sphinx could be a lot older. Some have been arguing that at one time there may have been two Sphinx guarding the entrance to the garden, which makes sense in a formal design point of view of symmetry if that was the original design intent. YouTuber Ancient Architect explains this possibility.
On the dream stela, between the paws of the Sphinx, placed there by Pharaoh Tutmosis IV, we also see a pair of sphinxes, indicating that the hidden Sphinx could well have been on display when the stela was erected. Jerry Cannon has also noticed that the right-hand Sphinx on the stela has clear female features and characteristics, compared to the male on the left, which is apparently a commonality in Sphinx carvings and reliefs across ancient Egypt. There doesn't seem to be a great deal more evidence to prove that the mound next to the Sphinx is actually its counterpart, and it certainly isn't enough to encourage authorities to agree to an excavation. So what do we know? Egyptologists state that King Khafre built the Sphinx between 2520 and 2494 BC, but there is absolutely no archaeological evidence to say that he built it or even repaired it. Looking at ancient records, one ancient Egyptian reference during the Middle Kingdom states that Khafre merely found the Sphinx and altered its face. The same source states that another Sphinx faced this one on the opposite side of the Nile, being built to represent the dividing line between northern and southern Egypt. But there is one other Middle Kingdom source that states that Khafre did build it. But if there are two Sphinxes, maybe both sources are in fact correct. It wasn't just the Egyptians that documented a second Sphinx. The Greeks and the Romans also mention it, and it is thought to have been destroyed around 800 to 1000 years ago. The primary sources all talk about a second Sphinx being opposite, not by the side, and there is even more evidence. The Arab writer Al-Idrisi, who lived between 1099 and 1166, stated that the second one was built of mud brick and faced with stone. Around 1200 AD, Cairo was subject to a large earthquake, and people used casing stones from the Great Pyramid to rebuild part of the town, so the same could have been the case with the second Sphinx, which exposed the underlying mud brick, leaving it to deteriorate in the weather. Like the ancient Egyptian source, Al-Idrisi states that the second Sphinx faced the Great Sphinx on the other side of the Nile when the river was far closer to the Giza complex. The migration of the Nile eastwards then erased it in its entirety. This is corroborated in the Annals of Rabi II from 1024 AD, where it states that there is a smaller Sphinx across the Nile in a ruined state of brick and stone. As well as being sat side by side, Sphinxes do face each other on avenues, and the Nile was, of course, the grandest avenue in Egypt. Like Jerry Cannon and Malcolm Hutton, I do believe there was a second Sphinx. I believe that Khafre discovered the truly ancient Great Sphinx, removed the sand, and then built its counterpart on the opposite side of the Nile, a far cruder construction. Therefore, the source from the Middle Kingdom that states that Khafre built the Sphinx is completely accurate, but this has been purposefully taken out of context by modern Egyptologists to fit their narrative.
So this hint in Genesis about an entrance could be originally inspired by the Nile Delta entrance, which is an element of a garden, or the main threshold space. Example of this idea is a garden gate along a path. It was the Nile River where the main pass of entry for trade was. The secondary paths of circulation would have been the branching of 3 to 4 small rivers, with the third pass being canals, and finally dirt roads, which create a hierarchy network of access in the garden. These paths dictate the movement of people that define smaller spaces within the larger space of a garden, creating this idea of spaces within spaces that have different ownership and function. And some of these paths may have been strategically laid out. There's also another hint that Genesis gives us, this idea of nakedness.
The Egyptians, like people today, were also very keen on how they looked. And I mean, image, I won't say was everything, but it certainly played a large part. So the Egyptians spent quite a lot of time, it appears, on adorning themselves.
The fabric of choice for virtually all Egyptian clothing was linen, made from the fiber of flax plants. Although Egypt is today famous for cotton, it wasn't grown in ancient times. It was linen that filled Egypt's looms and was spun into a variety of clothing for the king and his subjects. For the peasant, dress was little more than a loincloth. But for wealthy Egyptians, linen was amazingly versatile and could be fashioned into everything from beautifully pleated skirts to delicately thin shawls. Records found in the ruins of one village also show that long before the first boutique, Egyptian women had a sense of fashion and vanity.
I do think that the ancient Egyptian women were conscious of their dress, and one of the quotes we have coming up several times is women complaining that they don't have a thing to wear. And they obviously had something to wear, but it wasn't good enough.
Although many working-class Egyptians spent their days barefoot, getting around Egypt involves walking over a lot of sharp rocks and hot sand. Sandals were popular. The wealthy could afford to have theirs made of leather. The poor accepted straw footwear. Jewelry, even for the poor, was an important part of the image Egyptians wished to present. But no part of grooming and personal style had greater importance than makeup.
Now, even Neolithic hunter and gatherer people were not completely naked. We shouldn't take this idea of nakedness too literal. The notion that before agriculture we were completely naked is just not true. Sure, some tribes were naked, like in the Amazon, but it depends on the climate and their culture. Even Neanderthals clothed themselves to some degree to protect themselves from the elements and to suppress their sexual urges. But what I think Genesis is referencing is a cultural attitude shift on sexuality as clothing became more accessible with the use of cotton and new techniques of making clothing. It was also a political and religious difference that led to the factions breaking off of Egypt, which we see with the Jews. There may have been this shame of association with the Egyptians that the Jews wanted to break away from, and clothing is one cultural difference that started to emerge, which led to an attitude change on sexuality, in turn changing their identity. For example, like what we see with different factions in Islam compared to secular groups, or even within secular cultures. For example, the sexuality of Japan is very different than that of America, which might explain the psychological stigma on the upcoming movie Alita Battle Angel, knowing that it was a Japanese adaptation. So a cultural attitude on sexuality depends on the homogeneity of a culture and its moral ethic, which affects their way of dress and behavior, but also climate is a factor. So this also applies to the ancients, such as between the Egyptians and groups that broke away like the Jews. So what I think we have here is a cultural shift between the Jews and Egyptians in the way of dress due to the Jews becoming more patriarchal and more emphasis was placed on modesty as a virtue. But it could also be simply due to locality change. As the Jews became more nomadic, it was important to protect themselves from the heat and the sand. But in the Nile Delta, this is not as much of an issue due to the microclimate that the Nile Delta creates. We also see evidence of this cultural attitude on sexuality with the Minoan civilization, which many archaeologists believe was greatly influenced by the Egyptians, and may have even been Egyptian at one time, just as the Jews were. Now, is there a deeper esoteric meaning? I would say yes, to some degree, when it comes to certain symbolisms of it, but symbolic concepts tend to be born from practical events and places. I think there is a connection between the Bible's reference of nakedness and the supernatural affecting humans' genetics. Another design idea that might give us a hint that Egypt's Nile Delta is the Garden of Eden is the pareidolia observation of the snake, which is referenced in Genesis. If you look at the shape of the Nile, it has an uncanny appearance of a cobra. I don't think it would have been hard for the Egyptians to be aware that the layout of the Nile has this appearance when looking down from a mountain to map out your territory. This could explain why Middle Eastern cultures venerated the snake without realizing what the original inspiration was. Dr. Francesca explains the significance of the snake but fails to address the observation as a hint and the supernatural context of what might have transpired, as Dr. Michael Heiser would argue, to what was the original sin. Keep in mind the basic characteristics of a snake. Choosing a snake for your symbol is about power. It's not an animal with humbling characteristics like a bunny. This is common sense. The snake is a carnivore and the bunny is a herbivore, so more than likely the Egyptians were aware of these traits. To the Egyptians, everything was about power, power over death through healing. It was this lust for power that may have caused the demise of the pre-dynastic Egyptians, but Dr. Francesca tries to twist this around.
There's no reference in Genesis to the snake being Satan or the devil, so what exactly is it doing in the story? I think that originally, the canny creature was not a villain at all. Elsewhere in the Bible, we find evidence of the snake once playing a very positive role. The great biblical hero Moses carries a staff that becomes a serpent as he leads his people to the Promised Land. And originally the serpent also played a key role in the Jerusalem temple. The Bible describes winged creatures, seraphs or serpents, who fly around the throne of God in the temple. But these aren't Satan or a manifestation of evil. They're the faithful servants of God who fly about him singing his praises. This imagery derives from serpent worship, which was once an accepted part of the Jerusalem temple, where people would make offerings to a bronze serpent called Nehushtan. Serpents were considered to be death-defying creatures. They held the secrets of life and death. They stored venom in their bodies, they shed their skin, and they could regenerate themselves. As a result of this, they were powerful agents in healing cults. But there's a point in the history of the Bible when the snake turns bad. Serpent worship was once a normal part of religion, but by the time the Garden of Eden story was written, it was no longer acceptable. The serpent fell from grace when the temple was destroyed. The destruction was seen as a punishment from God for the crimes of his people, the religious crimes committed in the temple, and that included serpent worship. The inclusion of the serpent as the crafty villain of the Eden story is a deliberate move to discredit the snake cult. But the demonizing of the snake wasn't entirely successful. Its original symbolism did survive, and it lives on to this day as an emblem of healing.
What Dr. Francesca fails to understand that Dr. Michael Heiser sees through his knowledge of linguistic anthropology is that there are hints of a supernatural event that had to transpire in order for these stories to start to make logical sense, and not just over-symbolize allegories. What Dr. Michael Heiser and authors like Manly P. Hall stress is the original sin of man and the angels is it had something to do with the abuse of magic, with the incarnation of supernatural beings into the cohabitation of Homo sapiens in a particular place and time, and I think that place would have been somewhere near Egypt. And the most well-known case of a supernatural being taking human form is Jesus, who is like an avatar, one could argue. It was this desire to become Superman that was the original sin. The angels or the gods were interfering with the natural evolutionary process of man. I might point out that the symbol of Superman after 1941 started to resemble a snake. I don't think this was a coincidence, seeing that the Nazis were promoting the idea of the Aryan race of Supermen. Comic directors probably were aware of the S resembling a snake, so they changed the design to resemble the American rattlesnake confined inside a diamond-shaped shield, which I might add kind of resembles the Nile Delta. If any of these comic directors were Freemasons, they would have been aware of the symbolic meaning of the snake and its relation to Egypt. Also, in occult circles, the idea of the lost Aryan race of Superman could be a reference to the Nephilim, with the characters of Genesis living for hundreds of years until God took that ability away by fading it over time and wiping out those with these supernatural gifts. As Manly P. Hall might put it, the Wizards of Renown. Keep in mind the title of Iranian is a reference to Aryans. What early occultists understood was the original Aryans, or the Nephilim, was about the use of magic altering the genetics of humans to speed up the process of evolution, in turn correlating that to race. A pop cultural analogy to this would be the idea of non-benders and benders of the elements having psycho or telekinesis abilities. Even the swastika might have its roots inspired by the sun god Amun-Ra and the Aten, symbolizing the unknown god or the hidden ones, which had characteristics when manifested as orbs of light. Nowadays, we call them UFOs. Other cultures reference these phenomenons which had characteristics similar to the sun as jinn, yokai, or will-o'-the-wisp, and the Holy Spirit, which had similar artistic depictions. So the sun was a logical choice to symbolize a supernatural phenomenon that the ancients may have witnessed. Professor Joseph Campbell explains in more detail on the origins of the swastika.
Well, it's a fire wheel, and the sun is a fire wheel, and the sun goes on the revolution. The question of the origin of the swastika is a moot question. It is not pinned down yet, and there are guesses. A prime guess, and a very good one, is that it began in late Paleolithic times with representations of the stork. The stork is a killer of serpents, and now we come to a whole body of symbols that I propose to speak about later. This one of fire and water, the eagle, stork, the serpent, the lion, the bull, the sun, and the moon. These all belong in polar consistency to the same symbolic context. The swastika may belong there. The earliest swastika of which we have any knowledge was found in the Ukraine in a late Paleolithic Magdalenian site, and it is on the lower wings of what seems to be a kind of a bird. We don't know what kind of bird it was, but this big swastika is described on the lower wings, an extremely elaborate one. That's a kind of unique occurrence of the swastika. The historic occurrence comes with the about late 5th and early 4th millenniums BC in the ceramic art known as the Samara style of Iran. It appears in Susa and all those places, and there the swastika comes in the center of these ceramic designs. This is the period when the beautiful painted pottery ware in geometric organization appears first, and this goes into China and India and all over the world and to the Americas.
Let's get away from the symbolization and focus on the geographic significance of Egypt, which YouTuber Lost History Channel explains.
The Great Pyramid at Giza is at the center of all the landmass on the Earth. It is at the center of all these ancient structures across the globe, and they all are in a direct line to the Great Pyramid. Does that not just blow your mind? Whenever you have eliminated the impossible, however improbable, whatever remains, that is the truth. In 1864, Charles Piazzi Smith, Astronomer Royal for Scotland, gave the Great Pyramid the coordinates with 30 degrees 00 north, 31 degrees 00 east, the location of the Great Pyramid of Giza. In addition, in October of that year, Smith proposed to position the prime meridian at the longitude of the Great Pyramid because there it would pass over more land than any other. He also argued the cultural significance of the location and its vicinity to Jerusalem. Frederick Augustus Porter Barnard wrote in his 1884 book, The Imaginary Meteorological System of the Great Pyramid of Giza, that the perfect location of the Great Pyramid along the longitudinal line could only have been purposefully done by its builders. So they must have known this. And in the September 1919 issue of the Terrestrial Board magazine, Mason William Gallagher stated that knowledge of the Great Pyramids being the geographical center of the world was determined by many years of scientific investigation, and that the Great Pyramid was likely to be the last of the present land surface of the Earth wonders to survive a cataclysmic event due to its positioning.
Now we all know Giza is not the center of the Earth. That depends on what map you're using, so it's somewhat subjective because the Earth's a sphere. If you're basing it off modern maps, then the center of the world would be off the coast of Ghana. But if you're looking at it through the perspective of the ancients, the region around Egypt and Israel was the center of culture and geography according to the Greek historian Hecataeus when looking at his map. They did not know of the Americas. It was only through the legend of Atlantis that there was any hints of a land beyond their known world, which the Egyptians may have first foretold about, which I made a video on that you'll need to check out. So I would agree on the logic of Charles Piazzi when it comes to the cultural significance and when it comes to looking at it through the perspective of the ancients. The genius loci, or the spirit of place, was very strong in people's minds in this region. I would even consider Egypt as part of the Holy Land. And I would even go as far to say that Egypt could have been the original inspiration of the legend of Agartha and Shambhala, as it is known in the East.
The legend of Shambhala has been one of the favorite motives of Tibetan Buddhism and similar religions throughout the centuries. It's a mythical paradise spoken of in the Kalachakra Tantra and the ancient scriptures of the Zhang culture, which predated Tibetan Buddhism. For some, Shambhala represents a mystical country, revealing itself only to the chosen ones, while others perceive it as a symbol of the hidden treasures of the heart. Shambhala is said to be the land of 1,000 names. It's been called the Forbidden Land, the land of white waters, land of radiant spirits, land of living fire, land of the living gods, and land of wonders. The Hindus call it Aryavarsha, and to the Russians it is known as Belovedaya. But throughout Asia, it is best known by its Sanskrit name, Shambhala, which can be roughly translated as place of peace or place of silence. The etymology of Shambhala suggests something profoundly divine, deriving from Persian roots meaning elevated candle or divine light. Sham is Persian for candle or light, and Bala means elevated, raised, or divine. Another name for Shambhala is Shangri-La. If we take out the H, we get Sangrila, which is very similar to the Portuguese word sangra. Its root sangral means Holy Grail, connecting this legend of Shambhala to the Holy Grail itself, which we will explore in a future episode. According to Tibetan descriptions, the kingdom of Shambhala is shaped like a gigantic 8-petaled lotus. Around the perimeter of the lotus is a circular range of lofty, snow-covered mountains. Between the 8 petals of the lotus are 8 lower mountain ranges, along which flow the rivers of Shambhala. There are 120 million cities in each of the petals of the lotus, making 960 million cities altogether. The center of Shambhala is surrounded by a smaller range of snow mountains, and within this inner ring sits Kapala, the capital of Shambhala. In Kapala, there are magnificent palaces constructed with precious metals and gems, gold and silver. Only the pure of heart can live in Shambhala. It's a place where love and wisdom reigns, and where people are immune to suffering, toil, and old age. There is no war or fighting. It's said that all of them are extremely wealthy, but have no need to use their wealth. It is written, luminous, immense, verdant, stately, and eternal. The kingdom of Shambhala is hidden, a towering range of impenetrable, glistening snow mountains, formed from time, frozen by the anger, lust, and ignorance of egoic fixation, completely surrounds it. In each province, farms, forests, lakes, and towns adorn the land, as dew in sunlight sparkles on a lotus's outstretched petals. This is the land where the intrinsic sacredness of humanity has never been lost and is always whole.
If you peel away the romanticization of the cultural appropriation of the lands of Tibet, we learn that the origins of this lost paradise myth came from the Persians, and from there could have came from the Egyptians and the Sumerians, but it has been lost to us due to the many languages and lands that have shaped this possible historical place into a cultural appropriated legend. Even today, New Age ideas like Hollow Earth, Flat Earth, believing it's in the Arctic or the Himalayas, or esoteric ideas erode away the original historical place. These ideas just don't make any anthropological sense to me. As someone studying landscape architecture, I look at what the geographic features are telling us and what hints they are giving us to a real place that this legend may have been inspired by. We have to stop romanticizing these myths and make it relatable to real history. Another hint that tells us Egypt might have been the first megalithic and agricultural civilization is what its layout is telling us, which researcher Robert Bauval tells us.
If ancient Egypt noticed precession through the millennia, then Bauval arrives at a stunning possibility. It has to do with the core of its being, where all myths converge. Zep Tepi, the first time. Ancient Egypt believed that here is where it all began, the mound of creation. But when did it begin? Controversy has raged about the age of the Sphinx. Some believe it to be thousands of years older than thought so far, but there's no doubt where he looks at.
And he looks due east when the sun rises at the equinox. It is obvious that he is a marker of time, but the time that he really tells is the first time, the beginning of time, Zep Tepi, when the Lion King on earth looked at the cosmic lion and the sun in the sky at 11,500 BC.
11,500 BC? But astrologists would indeed call this the age of Leo, when the sun rose in that constellation. And if ancient Egypt believed, as above so below, the lion on earth would indeed look at the lion in heaven.
The idea of it being a lion, these very bright people who set up these monuments were highly intelligent, and they did nothing out of sheer abandon. They had a good, logical, according to their beliefs, scenario, and they kept to it.
And there's more to suggest an unbelievable scenario.
And remember precession.
11,500 BC is the time when Sirius first appeared in the land of Egypt at the magical day of rebirth.
This is what I think the Egyptians meant when they spoke of the first time and the coming of the phoenix to create the cycle of time. Let's look at this landscape carefully, this place, this region where they tell us was the beginning of time, the time of creation, the Tepi.
Under the pharaohs, the Giza pyramids had their tops covered in gold, as had others nearby. Egyptologists have begun to wonder whether this was to make them connect with other monuments within sight. The father of astronomy, the Greek Eudoxus, describes a large tower where Egypt's priests came to observe the stars at what the ancients called Letopolis, some 20 miles due north of the Great Pyramid. Its diagonal aimed at the great temple of Heliopolis. The three formed a straight triangle, visible day and night as sun and moon lit up their golden tops.
Now imagine that you were at Letopolis at that time of 11,500 BC, and you were looking directly south. What would you see? A landscape that is uncannily similar to what you have on the ground. The Nile in alignment with the Milky Way, the three stars of Orion's belt exactly in the same angle and in the same configuration as the pyramids on the ground. And when you go east, here is what you would see. The constellation of Leo, this Horakti in the sky, directly over the temple of Ra Horakti. And a short while later, you would see the sun blazing right above the temple. This cannot be a coincidence.
The sky locked in the image of an incredibly distant past. And Bauval sees even more that points to 11,500 BC. To the ancient Egyptians, the 70 days when the star Sirius disappeared from the sky were crucial. Mummification, all of Egypt awaited the moment of rebirth, these 70 days.
Now let's see what happens in the sky. The sun is here in this position, in Leo, when the star is being reborn at dawn. But let's see what happened 70 days before. The whole landscape of the sky seems to be slipping, and the sun is moving backwards. We're going to a place somewhere about here on the west side of the Milky Way.
If as above so below holds true, west of the Milky Way should take us west of the Nile.
Now if this theory is correct, if these three stars represent the three pyramids on the ground, we know that the pyramids are 950 meters apart. Working on the same scale, this distance should be about 9.5 kilometers. We should expect to find some sort of sun temple, probably a sort of sun harbor, where the sun is about to cross the Milky Way and head towards the constellation of Leo, the Horakti, the temple of Horakti in the sky. So let's see what we have on the ground. And as predicted, here we are at the Sun Temple of Abu Ghorab. And if you follow the alignment of this axis, you will see that it is exactly 9.5 kilometers from the Great Pyramid of Giza.
If Robert Bavau is right, then what we are seeing is a master plan layout of Egypt, not disconnected placement of pyramids and temples from competing pharaohs. There is a feng shui happening here. The pre-dynastic pharaohs are keeping to a master plan of memorializing the dawn of civilization with the blessing and curse of the angelic host. So other researchers and YouTubers have inspired me to conclude that Egypt must have been the first civilization that was relatively ahead of its time than any other prehistoric culture. Now, I disagree with the ideas that there were some lost Type 1 planetary civilization, as Dr. Michio Kaku would put it, because I just don't see massive amounts of stone evidence that the Earth ever reached a population of over 1 billion, let alone 7 billion. Now, it is possible in a very specific location that the material evidence could be totally recycled or destroyed by natural disasters, eroding all trace of a more advanced period in Egypt's past, with only the largest structures remaining. But to say the whole Earth had a civilization more advanced than ours is simply improbable. We should see millions of skeletal remains concentrated on particular stratification, but what we see instead is the remains of subhuman species. But what I think we have here with Egypt is a blessing and a curse of a supernatural intervention granting mutant-like abilities for some. Also, the pre-dynastic Egyptians may have reached a technological level of the Romans and even 17th century technology when it comes to certain construction techniques, which was passed down to the Greeks and the Persians. The way I think Egypt was able to move megalithic structures is similar to how the Russians moved the Column of Alexander in St. Petersburg, or how the Freemasons had the obelisk in Central Park moved. Advanced mechanical techniques with scaffolding, pulleys, levers, cranes, ropes, alloyed metal tools, beasts of burden, boats, and many other clever techniques is what made Egypt a megalithic culture. From there, the knowledge was passed down from master to apprentice. This is far more plausible than saying some lost planetary civilization or aliens. Egypt was more advanced and unified than any other culture because of its unique geography. The knowledge of building megalithic architecture may have been dispersed from Egypt after a catastrophe for those who kept the trade and passed the knowledge down as far as Japan. But by that time, it's indistinguishable from Egypt due to cross-pollination of cultures. All we have is a few hints of a collective memory in our past of a lost civilization that gave birth to many other cultures, such as the Phoenicians, which I will explain in part 3, so stay tuned for that and let us know what you think about this hypothesis on the Garden of Eden. Thank you.